There's a man in apartment 4B who hasn't had a real conversation with a woman in 3 years. Not a date. Not even a phone call that lasted more than 5 minutes. He's 52, owns his place, has a decent job, and from the outside, his life looks perfectly fine. But here's what nobody sees. The way he freezes when a woman smiles at him in the grocery store. The split second of panic before he looks away. The entire internal monologue that happens in that moment about what she might be thinking, what he should say, whether he's even allowed to respond. This isn't about all men who live alone. But there's a specific psychological shift that happens to some men after years of solitary living, and it completely rewires how they perceive, interact with, and understand women. And most people have no idea this transformation is even happening. Let me show you what's really going on inside these minds. The idealization trap. After the first year of living alone, something subtle starts to happen. Women stop being real people with flaws, bad days, and morning breath. They become concepts, ideas, and here's where it gets interesting. The longer a man goes without regular female interaction, the more women transform into either angels or obstacles. There's rarely anything in between. Think about this. When you interact with someone daily, you see them argue about trivial things. You watch them be petty, tired, unreasonable. You witness their humanity. But when your only exposure to women comes from passing them on the street, seeing them in movies, or scrolling past their curated social media profiles, your brain fills in the gaps with fantasy. I talked to Marcus, a 54-year-old software engineer who lived alone for 7 years. He told me something that perfectly captures this. I built this image of what a woman should be like. Kind, understanding, always put together, never moody. Then I finally went on a date, and she complained about her co-worker for 20 minutes. I remember feeling almost betrayed, like she wasn't playing the part right. Here's what most people miss. This isn't about being shallow or unrealistic. It's about the brain's desperate attempt to make sense of an absence. When you don't have regular data points, your mind creates a template based on incomplete information, and that template becomes rigid, calcified. The man living alone for years starts to judge every woman against this impossible standard he's constructed in isolation. She's too loud, too opinionated, too casual, not because she's actually any of these things objectively, but because she doesn't match the phantom woman who's been living in his head, rent-free for the past 5 years. But here's where the psychology gets darker. The resentment equation. Let me paint you a picture. It's a Tuesday night. Our man in apartment 4B finishes his microwave dinner and sits down to watch television. He sees a commercial with a happy couple laughing over coffee, then a dating app ad, then a romantic comedy preview. 3 reminders in 15 minutes that he's alone. Not by cosmic accident, but by a series of choices and circumstances that somehow led him here. And slowly, invisibly, a narrative starts to form. Women these days don't appreciate good men. They only want a certain type. I'm too old, too boring, too ordinary. These thoughts don't arrive as dramatic revelations. They seep in like water through concrete cracks, slowly, persistently, until the foundation shifts. Here's the thing that nobody talks about. Resentment doesn't need grand injustices to grow. It thrives on small repeated disappointments. Every unanswered message on a dating app, every friendly conversation that goes nowhere, every time he musters the courage to show interest and gets a polite but distant response. The isolated man starts creating a story where women are the gatekeepers to something he deserves but can't access, not because he's genuinely been wronged, but because the human brain craves explanations for pain. And when you're alone with your thoughts for years, those explanations don't get reality checked. I want you to understand something crucial here. This resentment isn't usually aggressive or violent. It's quieter. It shows up as cynicism, as withdrawal, as a man who says women are too complicated when what he really means is, I'm terrified of being rejected again. Think about what isolation does to perspective. You know how when you repeat a word over and over it starts to sound strange and loses meaning? The same thing happens with rejection in isolation. Each no echoes in an empty apartment with nobody to say, hey, that's just part of dating. It happens to everyone. Each disappointment becomes proof of a larger pattern rather than a single data point. So what do you do if you recognize this pattern in yourself? First, understand that your brain is doing what brains do, pattern recognition. It's trying to protect you from further pain by creating rules. Don't approach women who look like X. Don't bother with women who seem Y. But these rules are based on a sample size too small to draw conclusions from. Second, get around people, not just women. People. Join a hobby group, volunteer, take a class, not to meet women, but to recalibrate your social instincts. You need to remember that humans, all humans, are inconsistent, sometimes disappointing, occasionally wonderful, and mostly just trying to get through their day like you are. But there's another layer to this that's even more subtle. The museum effect. Here's what happened to Robert, a 60-year-old accountant who lived alone for 9 years. He finally started dating again, and the woman he was seeing wanted to come over to his apartment. He panicked. Not because his place was messy, but because he realized his entire living space was a shrine to his own preferences. Every object, every piece of furniture, every routine had been optimized for an audience of one. He told me, I realized I hadn't compromised on a single thing in nearly a decade. Not what to watch, not where to eat, not what temperature to keep the apartment. I'd forgotten how to share space. Let that sink in. When you live alone long enough, your environment becomes a museum of yourself. Everything is exactly where you want it. The remote has a specific spot. Dinner happens at a specific time. The bathroom routine is sacred and unchanged. This sounds peaceful, and it often is. But here's the hidden cost. Women stop being potential partners and start being potential disruptors. The man living in his self-made museum begins to see women through a lens of logistics rather than connection. If she moved in, where would her stuff go? She'd probably want to change the furniture. She wouldn't understand why I do things this way. Notice what's happening here. Women aren't people to build a life with. They're variables in an equation that currently balances perfectly, and any variable you add threatens to tip the scales. I've seen this manifest in the strangest ways. Men who won't date women who like different TV shows because they've already optimized their streaming schedule. Men who dismiss potential partners because they prefer cats to dogs, and the dog routine is non-negotiable. These aren't preferences anymore, they're fortifications. Here's what's actually happening psychologically. The brain has been in survival mode for so long that it's forgotten growth mode. In survival mode, change equals threat. In growth mode, change equals possibility. But switching between these modes requires practice, and isolation doesn't provide that practice. Think about how muscle memory works. If you don't use a skill, you lose it. The same applies to flexibility, compromise, and the ability to merge your life with someone else's. These are social muscles, and years alone have let them atrophy. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The competence paradox. Something fascinating happens to men who successfully build a solo life. They become extremely competent at being alone. They can cook, clean, manage finances, maintain a home, organize their time. They don't need anyone for practical purposes, and this competence becomes a trap. Let me show you how this actually works. A man spends 5 years mastering the art of solo living. He's proud of it, rightfully so. He's self-sufficient, but then he meets a woman, and suddenly his competence becomes a barrier. Because if he doesn't need her for anything practical, the relationship has to be built on something more abstract. Emotional connection, vulnerability, companionship. And here's the brutal truth. Those are the exact skills that atrophy fastest in isolation. David, a 57-year-old engineer, described it like this. I could handle anything life threw at me. Broken pipe, fixed it. Tax issues, sorted, health scare, dealt with it alone, but then I met someone who asked me how I was really feeling, and I didn't know how to answer. I'd lost the vocabulary for that kind of honesty. The competent, isolated man starts to view women through a narrow lens. What unique value can they add to a life that already functions perfectly? And when you're asking that question, you've already missed the point. Relationships aren't vendor transactions. But isolation teaches you to think transactionally, because that's the only framework that makes sense when you're a nation of one. Here's what most people miss about this dynamic. It's not that these men are cold or calculating by nature. It's that they've trained themselves to solve every problem independently, and they've forgotten that sometimes the point isn't solving the problem. Sometimes the point is having someone witness your struggle, share the load, or just sit with you in the uncertainty. Women, to the long isolated man, can seem inefficient. They want to talk about feelings when he's already identified the solution. They want to process emotions when he's already moved on. They want connection when he's mastered disconnection. And this creates a painful irony. The better he gets at living alone, the worse he gets at living with someone. So what do? You have to deliberately make yourself less efficient. Schedule things you wouldn't normally do. Say yes to spontaneous plans even when they disrupt your routine. Practice asking for help when you don't technically need it. These aren't weaknesses. They're social exercises designed to rebuild atrophied muscles. But there's one more shift that happens, and it's perhaps the most profound. The safety of distance. After years alone, something shifts in how threat is perceived. Intimacy starts to feel dangerous. Not physically dangerous, but dangerous to the carefully constructed self-image and routine that's kept the man afloat all these years. I want you to imagine building a house entirely by yourself. Every nail, every board, every decision yours alone. That house becomes sacred because it represents your ability to survive. Now imagine someone wanting to renovate it. Even if the renovations would objectively improve it, there's resistance. Because it's not about the house anymore. It's about what the house represents. Women, to the chronically isolated man, represent renovation, change, the potential for chaos in a system he's spent years stabilizing, and the longer he's been alone, the more threatening that potential becomes. Here's where the psychology gets interesting. The man starts to prefer the idea of women to the reality of them. He might spend hours on dating apps, swiping, chatting, even making plans. But when the date gets close, anxiety spikes. The safe distance is closing. The actual human with actual needs and actual unpredictability is about to enter his space, and often he sabotages. Not consciously, but through 1,000 small choices. He cancels at the last minute. He picks fights over text about trivial things. He goes silent. Because distance feels safer than presence. Marcus told me something that still haunts me. I realized I was more comfortable being lonely than being known. Lonely was familiar. Being known meant someone might see the parts of me I'd hidden even from myself. Think about that for a second. The isolated man constructs an identity in private, tested by no one, challenged by nothing. That identity might be completely disconnected from reality, but it's his. And women, with their observations and feedback and emotional intelligence, threaten to expose the gap between who he thinks he is and who he actually is. So he keeps them at arm's length, close enough to fantasize about, far enough to never truly risk anything. This is the final evolution of long-term isolation. Women become simultaneously desired and feared, wanted and kept away, the object of both longing and resistance. Here's what nobody tells you about coming back from years of isolation. It doesn't happen in one conversation, one date, or one relationship. It happens in tiny increments, in moments of discomfort that you don't run from. It happens when a woman contradicts you, and you resist the urge to dismiss her. It happens when you share something vulnerable and survive the awkwardness. It happens when you let someone rearrange the furniture in your life, literal or metaphorical, and discover the world doesn't end. The man who's been alone for years has to relearn something fundamental. Women are not puzzles to solve, concepts to idolize, or threats to manage. They're just people. Complicated, inconsistent, sometimes frustrating people who are carrying their own histories of disappointment and hope. And the only way back to seeing them clearly is through contact. Repeated, messy, imperfect contact. Conversations that go nowhere. Dates that feel awkward. Interactions that challenge every assumption you've built in isolation. You have to be willing to be bad at connection before you can be good at it again. And that requires a specific kind of courage. The courage to let someone see you're out of practice. The courage to say, I don't know how to do this anymore, instead of pretending you've got it all figured out. Because here's the final truth. The patterns I've described aren't permanent. They're reinforced by continued isolation, but they can be interrupted. The brain that learned to see women as concepts can relearn to see them as individuals. The heart that learned to protect itself through distance can remember how to risk proximity. But only if you choose exposure over safety. Only if you value growth over comfort. Only if you're willing to dismantle the museum, rethink the equations, and step out of the carefully controlled solo existence you've built. The question isn't whether it's possible. The question is whether you're willing to be uncomfortable enough, long enough to find out who you could become with. Someone else in the frame,